And so the latest developments show that Ukraine does not stand alone. There is continuous support. There were latest developments when it comes to the deal, when it comes to further financial support. And to talk about these things and the future of Ukraine when it comes to military scenarios and political scenarios, we have David Kirichenko, Associate Research Fellow, Henry Jackson Society, joining us now.
Well, thank you for having me on today.
Thank you so much for joining us. So as we are looking at the latest developments of the past few days, how would you say they're going to change Ukraine's situation?
Well, I mean, I think the very first impact and what some of the news from the last few days has shown is that American weapon systems being put to use, striking Russia itself and removing some of these restrictions on Ukrainian use of Western weapons has made big changes on the battlefield, and is showing that the more that we constrain Ukraine, the harder it is going to be for Ukraine to fight and to prevail against Russia. And so it's very important for Ukraine and its NATO partners to continue removing these restrictions and not just being able to hit the Russians near the border at Kharkiv, and this potentially deterred another Russian assault in northern Ukraine near the Sumy Oblast. And so it's going to be really important for Ukraine to be able to have more capabilities and the ability to strike further at both like Russian weapon depots, Russian supply chains, headquarters, and taking the fight to Russia and protecting Ukraine.
Yeah, it seems there's quite a disconnect between the military and the political leadership. Military leadership knows how to, well, get military goals done, but the political leadership has to decide on them. This new bilateral security agreement between the United States and Ukraine, there's wording in there that says that America supports Ukraine's efforts to win this war. Do you think that in and of, well, alone is a positive signal that indeed the Americans understand Ukraine's need to be able to increase its capabilities, and actually finally the United States needs to supply Ukraine with the means to win?
Right. I mean, like, we need to understand, what does victory mean? I think different NATO partners, Ukraine, have a different understanding of victory. It means, I believe Secretary of State Blinken said having Ukraine be independent and continue to be a democracy is a victory for the United States, whereas Ukraine wants to restore its 1991 borders and kick the Russians entirely out of Ukraine. And so it's important both for the U.S. to clarify what victory looks like, and then providing the means to them and giving Ukraine both the weapons and the ability to prevail on the battlefield. I think the challenges like that, both Ukraine and its NATO partners have a different understanding of victory is. And so I think it's good to see it trending in this direction, whereas previously Biden and other NATO partners would tell Ukraine that they're standing with Ukraine for as long as it takes and will always be by Ukraine's side. But that's very ambiguous wording. What does that mean? What does it mean standing by Ukraine's side? What is the final aim? And so if they're sincere about Ukraine's victory, they need to define what victory looks like. Is it restoring it to Ukraine's 1991 internationally recognized borders?
Mm-hmm. And as we look at the document itself, we read that it commits to support Ukraine in developing a modern NATO interoperable force that can credibly deter and, if necessary, defend against future aggression, stressing future aggression as a possible threat. What do you think Russia's response to this security deal could possibly be? What message does it send?
I mean, I think it's important to show Russia that the West will continue to stand by Ukraine's side, and it's going to make it a very costly endeavor for Russia to continue its war. But at the same time, it's not going to change Russia's calculus, because Russia understands if at any point it pauses this war and Ukraine receives security guarantees or goes into NATO, Russia can attack further. And so what Russia wants to make sure is not only does the war continue and destroy as much of Ukraine as possible, but it also wants to make sure that Ukraine can never rebuild. So if there's a permanent war or the threat of aggression happening, the private investors are not going to go into Ukraine. They're not going to help Ukraine rebuild itself, to strengthen itself, and then to join NATO. And so if Ukraine does not have concrete security guarantees, say by joining NATO, Ukraine can't rebuild, and it won't strengthen itself for Russia's future attempts of aggression.
Right. Well, we have this upcoming 75th anniversary NATO summit in Washington, D.C. just around the corner. What are Ukraine's expectations? I mean, we know that Ukraine would love to become a member of NATO, but we also know that it's simply untenable at this time. So in the best case scenario, what can we hear coming out of that NATO summit in July?
I think it's important what Ukraine needs to receive is continue to receive those ironclad guarantees, continue to push. I think the use case of what we saw in Kharkiv of lifting weapon restrictions, continuing to secure the supply of continuous aid, and lobbying for Zelensky's vision of what victory looks like, and supplying, as we discussed earlier, the means to the end, and helping Ukraine prevail on the battlefield. I think realistically, it's still going to be very hard over these years to convince NATO partners that it's time to admit Ukraine. But realistically, this war won't really end up until Ukraine does receive security guarantees such as joining NATO, because if Ukraine can't rebuild itself at some point, then like Russia gets what it wants and will continue attacking Ukraine until it dominates Ukraine. And so just continuing to push that message, securing support, and getting what it needs to prevail on the battlefield is what Ukraine is really going to be looking for here.
In recent days, weeks, and months, we've seen a buildup of security deals, support for Ukraine in terms of defense, in terms of the military. However, we are approaching a peace summit taking place in Switzerland. So Don mentioned the NATO summit in Washington. We have a peace summit happening only now. What would you say is going to come out of that? Because this sends a clear message that there is a willingness to find a different solution to the military one.
Well, I think Zelensky is a very strong statesman, and his lobbying. We saw him go to Southeast Asia, and he's been the other day he met with Modi of India, and he's been doing a fantastic job of utilizing diplomacy to rally support for Ukraine around the world. And I think that support is going to be reflected in the peace summit. And to a certain degree, I think Putin caught some people off guard by releasing his own, providing his own answer to the peace summit, and providing such draconian demands to have any sort of ceasefire. And so it shows that Putin is a little rattled. He doesn't like that a lot of the world is rallying behind Ukraine, and the world is dividing into these lines. And I think it makes Putin nervous that a lot of the world continues to stand behind Ukraine. So I don't think realistically is pushing both sides closer to this diplomacy, especially from Putin's demands of giving up, recognizing the annexation of Crimea, recognizing Russia's control over Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. And so Ukraine understands that it needs to continue to lobby around the world, secure more partners, and then put that pressure on Russia, either to loosen its demands or to be more realistic at the table for whenever negotiations do start between both sides. So it's trending in the right direction. I just don't think we're seeing the right signals from Russia that Russia is sincere at all about any sort of negotiations.
Certainly, I think the Institute for the Study of the War, that was their latest assessment, saying that despite the reports in the Western press, the signals that we're seeing out of Moscow certainly aren't ones of looking for a negotiated settlement. Now, very briefly, because we're almost out of time, we do have the upcoming U.S. presidential elections just around the corner as well. And, well, from your standpoint, do you believe, regardless of the outcome, that there are fears in case of Donald Trump taking over, potentially there could be a real bad situation for Ukraine. Do you think that's the case, or do you think that there'll be bipartisan support to continue to support Ukraine?
I mean, I definitely think it can be hard at times to decipher what's coming out of the Trump campaign, and I think they've gone a bit back and forth around what their support would look like for Ukraine. We've seen Trump make a variety of statements questioning our support for Ukraine aid, but then we did see that Mike Johnson lobbied Trump, was able to work with them and get it passed in the U.S. House, and ultimately passing a robust U.S. aid package for Ukraine earlier this year. And so behind all the campaign talk, I think if hypothetically Trump is elected, I don't think we'd see too much change support for Ukraine. And I think even in the Trump administration will understand how important Ukraine is, not just for European security, but the American security and the global world order. So I don't think we should encounter any surprises, no matter where the U.S. elections swing.
David Kirichenko, Associate Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you very much for joining us and expressing your views. We appreciate it.